Hello once again, audience. I see you're here to watch a video on US history. Well, today we're going to touch on the topics of the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott case, the North versus the South in the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and finally, Reconstruction plans after the Civil War. Now, to start off, let's ask ourselves, what brought about the need for the Compromise of 1850? Let's see. So there was issues with pro-slavery and anti-slavery going around at the time. America was expanding more and more, and the Missouri Compromise would eventually become difficult to enforce. So, in the Compromise, it admitted California as a free state. Hey, wait a minute. I don't like that. I want California to be a slave state. You know what? I'm thinking of seceding from y'all. Forget the Union. Now, don't worry. We'll implement popular sovereignty. Popular what, you say, dear boy? Popular sovereignty. A wise man named Henry Clay came up with this concept. Basically, this allows a state to determine whether a state will be pro or anti-slavery by voting for it. However, even with popular sovereignty to keep the Southerners from seceding from the United States, there were still problems that arose. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a man named Douglas proposed a bill to Congress that would divide the Nebraska Territory into two parts. Now, in this bill, it stated that these two states will be admitted through popular sovereignty. This is when things start to get a little bloody. There were thousands of border ruffians that crossed the border in order to illegally vote for slavery. Now, because of this, Kansas was declared a slave state. Abolitionists were unhappy of this turn of events, and they formed a rival government in Topeka. A bloody violence broke out, and this is what gives the name of the event Bleeding Kansas. As you can see, the United States did all it could to keep the United States unified. However, tensions continued to grow more and more and more and more. So, moving on. In the Dred Scott case, a former slave is fighting for freedom in court. His owner took Dred to free territory, then back to Missouri, which was slave territory. Now, this is America. You know, the land of the great, the land of the free, right? So that means Dred Scott got his freedom, right? No. Unfortunately, in this case, the Fifth Amendment worked against Dred Scott. The Fifth Amendment states that an American has rights over its own property, and in this case, a slave. Not to mention, Dred Scott was a slave, and he wasn't even considered a citizen, so he couldn't pursue a court case anyway. Northerners were generally upset because majority of the people in the Supreme Court at the time were Southerners who would vote against a slave's freedom. So all in all, this case would unfortunately permit the existence of slavery. So now with this unfortunate event, it's time for election. Guess who was elected for president? That's right, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln's victory upset the South. How shocking. They felt as if they didn't have a voice in the national government anymore. So, the South, being the South, seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as its president. The North and South now entered into a civil war, and both sides had its strengths and weaknesses. The North had more people, more railroad systems, greater food production, and even more factories. The South had strong military leaders and motivated soldiers. The North had more firepower and strength initially and were able to capture Confederate states. However, the South had generals like Robert E. Lee, who recaptured the capital, Virginia. So this proved that the South and the North were evenly matched despite, one's lack of resources, the South. So with all this crazy stuff going on, guess what happens next? Politics play a role in the war. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what this did was free all slaves in the United States territory. This gave a moral purpose for the war. To African Americans, this was the key to freedom. If the Union won, they were free. For this reason, African Americans also joined the war. So we all know what happens in the end. The Union wins. So now it's time for the long period of Reconstruction. To start off, there were 3 amendments that were added to the Constitution during this time. The 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to everyone born in the United States. And the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. No longer would the United States be divided between the issue of African Americans being slaves or citizens, or to have the right to vote. Now, keep in mind, this gave all men the right to vote. I'm sorry, women, but you don't get your time later until around the 1920s. So anyway, continuing on this trend of Reconstruction, Lincoln had a plan. He issued the 10% plan, which would forgive all Confederates who swore allegiance to the Union. Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia were all readmitted under Lincoln. Now, unfortunately, there were people who opposed this plan. They were known as the Radical Republicans. Now, with people opposing his plan, this meant that Lincoln was assassinated, and this would put Andrew Johnson into power, and he had his own plan. Andrew Johnson's plan was very similar to Lincoln's, except he tried to break the planters' power by excluding high-ranking Confederates and wealthy Southern landowners from taking the oath to get voting privileges. Later, Johnson was impeached, and Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. Groups such as the KKK arose and continued to oppose the Reconstruction. Eventually, the Reconstruction period came to an end. While not progress was made for the battle against discrimination, the implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment would help in the long run with the civil rights legislation. So audience, I hope you learned a lot today. Thank you, audience. And thank you, Mr. Bellows, for giving me this extra time to work hard on this video. I really do mean it. Well, audience, it's time to go again. See ya.